Before our children head out to children's church who are doing that, I wanted to just say we were singing the goodness of Jesus together. I was thinking about the words that we were singing. I thought if we all have to learn the message of that song over and over and over again. And the youngest ones in this room can sing, "Come you weary heart, now to Jesus." And he gives them rest. And when you're afraid of the dark and you're having a hard time going to sleep, he gives them rest. And when you're a teen and you have some different problems that probably aren't being afraid of the dark and having a hard time going to sleep that night, you can learn the truth again. Come you weary heart, now to Jesus. There's perfect love and comfort in your tears. Taste the living water. Never thirst again. Rest in his wondrous peace. And when you go to college and it's all new, if you go to college, you start your career and it's all new and you don't know how it's going to turn out, and you can still rest in his wondrous peace and learn the same lesson. And you can do it again and again and again, and we come together and we sing words like that to remind each other that that truth is just as true for the child who's struggling to go to sleep because they're afraid of the dark as it is for the Baker family here today. All the way from beginning to end. If we could learn the truths we just sang there every week, the goodness of Jesus, I'm satisfied. He's everything I need. May it be whatever comes, that I rest all my days in the goodness of Jesus. And by God's grace, which wasn't planned, not when we started it, we're at the end of Job today. Not the very end. Job 39, we'll do a couple verses in 38. Children, if you're headed out the door to children's church, you can go ahead and head back there. If you're staying in here with us, we'd love to have you here as well. Last week, as we looked at Job 38, we saw the first part of God's answer to Job. I told you then it's a complex answer because it's not a simple question. To talk about suffering and difficulty in sin and struggles, to talk about how that relates to Job being a blameless person, it's not a simple question, and so it's not a simple answer. Last week, God started with this challenge to Job. He said, "Who is this that questions my purposes without really understanding?" In a poetic, longer form, he said basically, do you have the power and the wisdom to handle the vast scope of creation, all the way from the tiniest atoms to the largest pieces of our universe? He said, can you work all those things together, Job? Do you know what's best? And even if you knew what was best, could you bring it about and make it all work? But in that section, which we didn't emphasize as much last week, God mainly talks about things in creation that are stable, mostly, and repeatable, like cycles, things like the sea with its limits. You say, well, that doesn't sound very stable. No, but none of us are worried that the Atlantic Ocean is going to crash into our front yard. It might move a little bit. Hurricanes may come, and if you live on the coast, maybe that's a difference. But if you live here in Knoxville, if it floods Knoxville, we've got bigger problems. Or the sun with its patterns. Every one of us woke up this morning expecting a sunrise. And it was there. And it will be there the next day. These are huge things that you and I can't plan. We can't put all these pieces together and work out all the details of how and why and gravity and all these different things, but it's repeatable. It's a cycle. We talk about weather and we jokingly say, the weatherman could be wrong half the time or all of the time and nobody cares. But the point is there's enough patterns that you can predict some things, or at least try. So God points Job to parts of his world which impact you, that impact all of creation, that don't seem controllable, but they seem regular. They have limits, they have cycles. In the part of your life where you might say, I can understand the design. The sun comes up again, and it comes up again, and it comes up again. And God's design is good and wise in those things. So what about in the wilder parts of creation? What about if you look past the limits and cycles and go to the edges, to the frontier of creation? That's where God turns his attention in the next section. Beginning in Job 38, starting in verse 39 of Job 38, God just continues with what he's saying to Job. He says, can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens, or lie in wait in their thicket? No lion out there is waiting on you to come give them food. Right? God uses all these little snapshots. First, lions, and you think of the pictures, think of the National Geographic specials where you see the lion crouching and stalking its prey, and then the gazelles take off and the lions, and you might not want to think too much about what happens after that. God designed that lion. It's an apex predator. It's not afraid. It does not need you to feed it. That's God's question. He said, can you give it its food? Does it just wait? It's where he says, when they crouch in their dens, they lie in wait in their thicket. The picture is like, is a lion sitting in his living room with his feet kicked up waiting for you to bring him dinner? God says, no, I designed this so that it works differently than that. Think of stories about lions, and we see them, where even lions who were raised from the tiniest lion, there are tragedies that we hear where the person who raised them, the lion tamer or the circus handler or the conservationist, sometimes is killed by the lion. Because there's a wildness to that. But God wants Job to say, all right, go to the edge now, go to a wilder section, a section where most of us aren't afraid of the sun. Maybe sunburn, but we're not afraid that it rises every day. Now go to a section of creation where you might be afraid. It feels more wild, like the lions. They're designed perfectly as well. They're designed so that they are good at killing things. Probably most of us, if you threw, and myself for sure, if you threw us into the frontier, give me a pocket knife and say, survive. It's not going to end well. But that lion has no problems. God says, now look at that design. It's wild. It may feel untamable. It may feel like it's all kinds of dangerous things. God said, I made that. And it's really good at what I made it to do. How about the raven? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? The same kind of question. He's saying, do the baby birds, the baby ravens, are they sitting there wondering about starving, just waiting for you to tell them, here's where you can get food? In the back edges of the desert, where no one put them there, no one put up, we put up a little birdhouse in our backyard. Nobody set up a birdhouse for these ravens. Nobody put out a bird feeder, and yet they operate just like God designed them, in the wild edge. And the New Testament says God feeds the birds. God looks at Job and says, you don't feed the birds. They're not waiting on you. My design is good. This happens in our backyards. But it also happens by God's design, by God's plan, in the middle of the jungles of the Amazon, where no human even sees it. God's design at all of the edges, go to the recesses and the wildest part of his creation, and God's design is good. And God looks at Job and says, they're not sitting around waiting on you to fix my design, Job. He keeps running through examples in chapter 39. We think about mountain goats. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months they fulfill? Do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. It says, Job, do you know how all that works? And you think of mountain goats, think of the way when you have this rocky crag that looks like absolutely nothing could possibly go up it. And you see these crazy pictures of mountain goats. They're halfway up. And they're just standing there like it's standing on flat ground. They're incredible. God made them that way. God says, think about that. Now, in our modern scientific arrogance, we might hear this question the wrong way. When God says, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? You might say, well, yes, we can find that information. I can Google it. But his point isn't just, do you know when it happens? His point is, do you know not only when it happens, but can you number the months they fulfill? Not just do you know how long, but can you plan it? God's saying, I designed the number of months. We know different animals. Elephants have a gestation period of, I think, 2 years. And then you go down to a whole lot less for other animals. God knew the right amount to do for each animal, so that the result would happen like he talks about, verse 4, their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. In other words, God says, I designed the process of the birth of a mountain goat at the wildest edge of creation where you've never seen, Job. I designed that so that when they have their baby mountain goat, it's ready to live in the world. None of them are like half-baked. They're ready. Even if you and I could somehow design, let's say we could try it. Like, let's try 3 months. Nope, that's not long enough. Let's try 6 months. That's not long enough. Let's try 12 months. Whatever time you want to try, we would have to use trial and error. God says, I made this mountain goat. I made it this way. And when I made it this way, the next mountain goat that was born was ready to go out. My design without trial and error is good. So he continues in verse 5. What about the wild donkey? Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey, to whom I have given the arid plain for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place? He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. God is subtly making points to Job here. He's not smashing Job over the head with the point. He's building a subtle case throughout both chapters to get the result he wants from Job. Here he says, let's look out at the deserts. We find this wild donkey. Who put him free out there? He could look at Job. He doesn't ask exactly this question, but it's implied. Job, would you have put him out in the desert? If you were told, here's this nice, great green place where you could put this donkey, or here's this other place that looks kind of dry and steamy and sticky, you probably would have chosen the nice green place for the donkey. But he says, now here's what happens. The wild donkey doesn't have the tumult or the busyness of the city. He doesn't have the driver like whipping at him, making him do work. He's happier. The donkey would rather be there. If you had a choice and you could take a wild donkey from the deserts of the Middle East and you could throw them in the middle of downtown Knoxville, they would much rather be in the desert. God made them that way. God says, Job, I designed the wild donkey at the edge of creation so that this is perfect for him, even though some other animals would hate it. It would be terrible for them, but it's great for this donkey. How about a wild ox? Notice these questions God asks him. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Does he show up and say, hey, what should I do today, sir? No. Will he spend the night at your manger? Well, you might tame him to do something, maybe. But is he going to just show up and say, oh, great, I can stay in your place? No. Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? We might think, well, is he just saying, can you plow with an ox? But he continues, will you depend on him because his strength is great, and will you leave to him your labor? So you show up as the farmer, you look at the ox and say, great, plow the field for me, and then you walk off. God says, that's not going to work out for you. You won't do it that way. You know better, Job. Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? God says, Job, can you not only tame and use the wild ox? That's one thing. But he's not just talking about that. Job, can you so design or tame the ox that it goes and does your job for you? No, of course not. But the implication and the right answer is God is saying, I can. I designed this wild ox so that where it is and what it is doing in the wild accomplishes my purposes. God says, it does exactly what I wanted. I designed it so that in the wild edge of creation, it accomplishes what I want. Job, you can't even tame it to the point that it will do that. I made it to do that. We get to a section here about the ostrich. This is the strangest section in this whole section of Job. He says, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? I'm guessing that's nobody's favorite verse in the Bible, just for the record. For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young as if they were not hers, though her labor be in vain. Yet she has no fear because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider. There's a weird translation question, so I'm going to take a minute to say this. In case you're looking at a different translation, it may look really odd. Verse 13, when it asks, are they the pinions and plumage? Are they the wings of love, basically? The word for love and the word for a stork is the same thing, strangely enough, in Hebrew. So depending on which translation, they're going to go with one or the other. So it's either, if stork is the right translation, then it's saying the ostrich has these beautiful wings, but it can't fly, so it doesn't do it any good like the stork has. In other words, there's a design here that looks good, but God didn't give it the same design as the stork. There's a wing that looks like you should be able to fly, but that's not the design God gave it. Or if it's saying love, then it's saying the ostrich looks like it can take care of its eggs for the same reason ultimately, but he's pointing to a different place. The ostrich looks like a good design, but look at how it treats its eggs. It doesn't have what looks like wisdom to us. The other birds protect. The ostrich seems to just lay its eggs. Now, we know the eggs are actually really tough, and the young ostriches and the eggs are actually pretty much okay. This is an appearance. The point overall is this, and think about hearing this with Job. Don't get lost in the ostrich. I know it's fun to imagine ostriches. Don't get lost in the ostrich. Think about what Job needs to hear. God's design is good, but God has not given the same instincts and design to every part of his creation. Now, when I look at ostriches and storks, that doesn't feel hard to say. When Job looks at it and says, My life seems to have been designed so that there's a whole lot of suffering right now. And my friend Bildad over there, his life does not seem to have been designed to have suffering right now. I don't like that. God, by pointing at his creation, is saying, now look, just because I don't design every creature exactly the same way or every human experience exactly the same way does not mean that I don't have a good design for every creature and every human experience. Just because your experience is not like mine or someone else's in this room does not mean that God designed one and crafted it beautifully and he completely forgot yours. Just because the eagle nests in the crags and in the heights and his eggs look protected, and the ostrich lays their eggs on the ground in a ground nest where they could be stepped on, doesn't mean God did not design them well. And that's why he goes in the last verse and says, looks like the ostrich doesn't have a lot of protection. They can't fly away. But when they rise up and run, they laugh at the horse and rider. Ostriches can run 40 miles an hour, maybe a hair more. Not just for a sprint, for extended periods of time. We know cheetahs are fast. Cheetahs sprint, and they don't keep that speed. The ostrich goes, I'm going to hit 40, and I'm just going to truck right on out of here, and you won't catch me. God says, I designed that. You look at it and go, those wings look worthless. And God says, yeah, but the legs are great. God has his design, and Job doesn't get to call God into question because he looks at it and says, you didn't make the ostrich fly. Speaking of horses and riders, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver of arrows, the flashing spear, the javelin. With fierceness and rage, he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. Did you make this horse? Now, we might think of horses as this is fun. We go and ride through the countryside. It's great. But this is a war horse in a time when they didn't have tanks or bombs. This was their tank. It pulled chariots for a reason. You put armor on a horse, and then we're going to give you a sword. Have at it. This is fearsome. It's terrifying, but God designed the horse so you can do that. Nobody that I know of has ever in the history of mankind tried to put armor on an ostrich and ride it into battle. But they do on horses. And yet the ostrich looks at that horse and laughs. I can run away from you. God is saying, look, wild ox, wild donkey, ravens, lions, war horses, ostriches, all of them, I made them. I did not make them all the same, but I made them good. They are designed for my purpose. What about the birds of prey? Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rock he dwells and makes his home on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey. His eyes behold it from far away. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he. Job, can you tell the eagles how to ride on the winds and soar? You watch these little birds, the little swifts or swallows, and they flit around on the wind, and it looks like so much fun. You see an eagle soaring majestically above everything else. He's not working like a hummingbird. God says, I made the hummingbird and the eagle. And my design's good for both of them. Do you teach them how to find safe nests? No, you don't, Job. Do you teach them how to not only find their food, but do you give them the eyesight so that they can? You hear about the eyesight of birds of prey. It's amazing what they can see. God says, I made that. I give them food. And so what Job is supposed to do here is marvel at God's design all the way from the huge cosmic cycles to the wild of the animal world. So God says in chapter 40, "Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Whoever wants to accuse me," this is God's answer. Now I want to pause. I told you this was a 3-part answer. This is not God's final answer. It's not everything God says, but it is part of it. God says, if you want to accuse me of being negligent or cruel in my design, it says, let him answer it. Literally, you could say, let him correct it. You do it better. Or you tell me how I should do it better. In what seems like a little bit of a different world, years ago, I played in orchestras. I played French horn. And there were times as a French horn player sitting in an orchestra, the conductor would say, "It needs to be more like this." And the horn players or any other instrument would look at each other and we'd say, "You try it." That works really well until the guy up there can actually play. And then you go, okay, fine. I heard a story of a man named Itzhak Perlman, who's one of the best violinists in the world. He also conducted for a while. And there was a case where someone basically had that attitude with him who played violin, and he said, okay, he took the violin from him and played it. Because he can. God is like that conductor, but infinitely more. It's like he's handing Job the instrument of creation, metaphorically, and saying, can you play it better? Can you design this better than I did? If you want to accuse me, then correct it. And Job responds, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? What shall I correct? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further." He doesn't quite say, "God, you're right," but he says, "I'll stop talking." We still have 2 more chapters to get the rest of the way. I wanted to give a modern illustration, which some of you have heard of. The complexity of the wildness of creation at the very edges. There's a story about Yellowstone. In the late 1800s, gray wolves roamed the park. By the end of the 1920s, they had basically been hunted to eradication, which sounds like a good plan if you're a farmer. You say, I don't really want gray wolves eating my sheep, so that's probably a good thing. Let's hunt them, let's get rid of them. Well, what they didn't anticipate is then the elk population in Yellowstone exploded. Which, okay, that's fine. I mean, we like elk. They look pretty. Well, they start grazing the landscape. Now erosion's a big problem because where there used to be, among other things, large willow stands alongside rivers, now the elks love to eat willow. And when there are no wolves eating elks, then the elk eat a lot of willow. To the point that the willows, they did some studies on this, and if the elk were not grazing, willows would grow about 83% of their height within 2 years. That's a lot. In the areas where the elks were grazing, they would have no more than about 6% growth. So a huge difference in the willows. Well, maybe that's not such a big deal. There's erosion. Not only that, beavers really like to eat willow trees and use willow trees. So the beaver colonies start dropping down. In 1974, the gray wolf was added to the endangered species list. And then in 1995, somebody had this great plan. Why don't we bring wolves back to Yellowstone? So they bring 8 wolves from Alberta, Canada, and put them in Yellowstone National Park. Now, when they did that, because God's design is so strong and so good, they couldn't just drop them off, because what would happen is the wolves would go back to Canada, which isn't next door. But they just go back up there. And in fact, they did. They had these acclimation pins where they would bring them in. They'd pin them in a section. They would actually bring elk that they killed so that the wolves could eat the elk and realize, hey, there's food here. This is good. They did that for, I forgot, the 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, to try and get them used to being in Yellowstone. They let them out. One of the wolves ran back to Canada anyway. Another one tried, and they got it and brought it back. But as then, just starting with 8 wolves, the elk population starts to go back down. It protected especially the open valleys where elk would be more vulnerable from overgrazing. In turn, willow plants became more healthy. Beaver colonies increased from 1 known beaver colony to something like 25, I think. The beaver's dams even out seasonal changes in water. They store water for the water table. They provide cold water for fish. Now the willow stands provide habitats for different songbirds, which now come back to Yellowstone. And I'm only looking at one slice. We could also talk about fires and droughts that happened in the same time period. Well, it used to be what killed the elk was when you had bad winters. That was the main predator because there weren't wolves there. So that meant in less extreme winters, there were fewer dead elk for scavengers like ravens or bears. But now, since the wolves kill more elk, there's more ravens and eagles, magpies, beetles, wolverines, lynx, coyotes, bears, and other things. If you're confused by now, I was. And that's the point. God designed his creation so well and in such an interconnected way. How could you ever, with your finite understanding, know best how to correct that design? You couldn't. Even the scientists who put wolves back in Yellowstone in 1995, they had no idea what was going to happen. They thought it would be a good plan. That was as far as they got. They had some theories. But they were looking at this little tiny slice of all of that would happen. That's God's design in the world. Now, imagine if you were a beaver sitting in Yellowstone when all of that happens. You'd be like, I have no idea what is going on here. And if you had the chance to talk to God, you might say, God, I don't really think this is a great plan. I don't really think your design is really good here. That's because the beaver doesn't know much. God's design in the wild is so complex. My understanding of it is probably not much better than that beaver. And so Job gets to this point where he says, I won't correct you. I don't know. I don't understand enough to correct. He doesn't quite say God is right, but he says, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And God needed to get Job to that point first, because there is a huge difference between a child who thinks they know better than their parent and a child who wants understanding from their parent. Those are very different things. We know it when we're the parent. And the same thing is true with God. There's a huge difference between what Job is at the end of this book, where Job is really saying, I think I know better than God. Let me make my case. He's gotten to the point where he's saying, he's not the child going, God, I don't understand and this is hard. He's the child saying, maybe God isn't really forgiving. Maybe God is petty. Maybe God just abuses his power. I can justify myself. If I had done these wrong things, I would understand, but I didn't. So God shouldn't do this to me. He had gotten to the point where he was the child who thinks he knows better than the parent. And the first thing God has to do is shut his mouth, is make Job realize you don't know better than the parent. And as we continue in the book next week, we'll see more of the response when God says, now you're listening. Let me tell you some more. I want you to think about your life as we conclude. I think our problem very often is we know we don't know everything God knows. We get that. But we also just look and we hurt because suffering is hard. We might sit here and say, I know I'm not God, but I'm not a beaver either. And Scripture has beautiful teaching for that. No, we're not beavers. We're humans made in God's image who will live, for those who have faith in Jesus Christ, will live forever with Him. And you might look at it and say, God, I don't like the way my life looks right now. I don't feel like I have the right good design that other person has in their life. And God does not call you to forget the suffering. God doesn't ask you to throw away your ideas of justice. He doesn't ask you to just not be satisfied or not find joy. He asks you to postpone those ideas and trust Him. To live in a world where you ache in the pain that's difficult, and you grieve in the sufferings, really grieve and really ache, where you long for perfect justice, and where you trust the powerful, loving King who knows better than you could ever know, and who willingly came and suffered in this fallen world for you. And you might think, can I really postpone that? Can I really trust when it hurts? And God says, yes, you can, by my Spirit, just like I did. Because Jesus came and Jesus suffered for the joy that was set before Him. He endured the cross. He felt the ache and the grief and the longing, and He looked forward and He trusted. And that's what God calls Job to do here. To say, life may be difficult, this stage of life, the rest of life, it may be very hard and painful, but I trust my King. I ran across a quote this week I want to close with by a man named Millard Erickson. He wasn't talking about Job, he was talking about God, but it fits. He said, if there really is a God, then He really must be God. This seems obvious, but the point is we should treat Him as God, not as something less. If there is a God who is the supreme, all-powerful, all-wise, all-loving being, then He deserves worship, obedience, praise, love, adoration, and much more. In the final analysis, if God is the infinite one and we are His finite creatures, then it is His will that is to be done, His word that is true, His glory that is to be sought. And it's here that much current popular religion goes astray. Sometimes one gets the impression that God owes humans something and that He must answer to them. We get the idea that His truth must make sense to them. His actions must be pleasant and pleasing to them. His will must not conflict with their freedom. He must not impose any duties on them. He must grant whatever they ask. We get the idea that that's what God's supposed to do. But if there really is a God, as He says, who is supreme, all-powerful, all-wise, and all-loving, then He deserves worship, obedience, praise, love, adoration, whether you understand Him at this moment or not. God really must be the highest good of our lives, the best treasure we could have, and the best goal. That's hard when you don't understand. And it's hard when you hurt. But just like Job had to see, he could get this tiny slice of creation that he could see. Couldn't make it, couldn't plan it, couldn't design it, but he could see this slice. And God is doing something so much bigger. The same thing is true in our lives, that when you hurt and you say, I don't know what God is doing here, or maybe I think God's doing this. You know a slice, a tiny fraction, like a 2-year-old child knows a little of what their parent is doing when their parent gives them food, but doesn't understand nutrition and doesn't understand all of these other pieces that we understand as parents. You might know a little bit of what God is doing in your life. You have no idea yet the scope that He's doing. But for those who trust in Jesus, you'll spend eternity learning more about Him and about His purposes, because He cares more about changing you and making you who you should be and giving you joy and satisfaction for eternity. He cares more about that than about alleviating pain right now. And we can trust Him for that. Praise God. I invite you to close your eyes and respond, just silently respond in prayer to God. And then in just a minute, I'll invite our teens to come back up, and we'll close by singing together. God, this room and our lives are full of a million questions. May our lives also be full of the trust and confidence and joy and rest that only You can give. We know that we will have many unanswered questions, and we will have many painful moments in this life. But we look forward to the joy, the pleasures that You give forevermore at Your right hand, and we look forward to that, and we long for the trust and rest that You give. Fill us with that this morning, and as we sing, may our hearts explode with praise, to say, no matter what happens, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless His holy name. In Jesus' name we pray.